Yeah? Hello, hello? Oh, yeah, okay. Woo. So we're going to move things along. It's a fast-paced day. We're going to start on time and really do our best to end on time. My name's Liz Hertz. I'm going to facilitate the process. Please let me know if there's something that's not working for you. If you can't hear, if you can't see, raise your hand. We'll try to take care of it. Very quickly, if you have not registered for the event, we're so happy that you're here. Don't worry about it. But please go over and visit Sally at the front and register on one of the computers there. Also, in your packet, there's a small card asking for your opinion and thoughts on next steps, what you'd like to see happen. You don't have to wait to the end of the day to fill that out. Fill that out at any time, and you can place it in the basket over there that Stephanie is showing us. Also, during the day, if you have one of those bubble thoughts that comes up and you don't want to lose it, there are stickies over there, so please add your notes to that sheet of paper. Again, you don't have to wait to the end of the day. So I'm going to turn the program over right now to Sam, our host, who will introduce the first speaker and also give you a little bit more information on how today came about and what we hope to accomplish.
Thank you, Liz. My name's Sam Belknap, and I am the project lead for the Island Institute Sea Level Rise work. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This conference has evolved out of many conversations we've had with communities all across the coast. Recognizing that all of the planning work in the world is great, but if you can't access the financing to implement projects, you're stuck. So that brought together a group of us to bring you all today and hopefully connect you to some of the resources to start thinking about how we can access different financing options to pay for coastal resilience. At the Island Institute, we work to sustain Maine's coastal and island communities and support them. And part of this is dealing with and being resilient to climate change. And when the IPCC tells us this week that the ice is melting and the seas are rising faster than originally predicted, it's all the more important that we're here today planning for the resilience of our coastal communities. So thank you all for joining us. I wanted to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors for this event, the law firm of Eaton Peabody, Maine Coastal Program, and the Municipal Planning Assistance Program. I also want to thank and acknowledge our co-hosts and partners in crafting this event, Victoria Boundy of the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, Martha Shields of the New England Environmental Finance Center, Alan Kratz of Resilience Works LLC, and all of my amazing colleagues at the Island Institute. Without you, this event wouldn't happen. So a few quick housekeeping items. Liz mentioned the feedback mechanisms that we have. Please take the time to share your thoughts and feedback with us. The product that we are able to put together in conferences like this is guided by your insights and your needs. So take the time to fill out the card, take the time to share your thoughts with us either at lunch or towards the end of the day because we really appreciate it and we're going to use this information to help us shape our next steps. A few quick other housekeeping items. There's a restroom in the rear of this room. There's also a restroom in the lunchroom behind us, and several restrooms in the farmers market as well. We are live streaming this. Hi, everyone. So try to keep the sound to a minimum in here. If you find yourself engaged in a conversation that you can't step away from or needing to take a phone call, please take advantage of the lunchroom. We're happy to have your network there. So also, I know I don't need to tell this crowd, but please take advantage of the recycling options that we have in the rear of the room today to limit our waste. And I also wanted to take a quick moment to thank those members of our federal delegation that are in attendance today. Thank you. We're glad to know that the folks in Washington are paying attention to coastal Maine. I also wanted to recognize Representative Bloom and any of the other state and state representatives and legislators that I have yet to notice. So thank you all for joining us today. Your attention to these matters are key to making a resilient coast. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Colgan. As the director of the Center for the Blue Economy, Dr. Charles Colgan oversees the conduct of research activities and serves as the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Economics. Dr. Colgan has also served as a consultant with the National Ocean Economics Program for more than 14 years. He served as Professor of Public Policy and Management in the Edmund S. Muskie School for Public Service at the University of Southern Maine and was the chair of the Muskie School's PhD program in public policy. His long-term economic forecasts are used by the Maine Department of Transportation and the Economic Development Districts of Maine. And prior to joining USM, he served in the Maine State Planning Office, was state economist and director of natural resource and economic policy. He is widely regarded as an expert in the field of adaptation and resilient finance. If we could all please welcome Dr. Colgan. Thank you, Dr. Colgan.
Morning. Great to be back in Maine. Just came in from California, going back next week. I spend most of my summers here. I spend all my summers here and the winters in Monterey, California. So when I got laid off from, or fired from USM, it seemed like a good deal. Most of my work these days is on the economics of adaptation to climate change in coastal regions of the world. We've done a lot of work in the U.S. We're doing a lot of work in California. We have projects here in Maine. We've done studies for the mid-Atlantic states, for parts of Southern California. We've also done a lot of work on how to pay for the necessary actions with respect to adaptation. Let me assure you, we think in Maine that California is this strange place somewhere beyond the Rockies where there's plenty of money and people are a little weird. Some of that's true. Been there 4.5 years and gotta say some of it's true. But if you went to California and you had a discussion with local government officials about climate change adaptation, it would look just like you were in a town meeting in Maine. The only difference is the county governments count for a little bit more, but the local officials in California all start with, where's the money? Now in California, they have actually a tax system that's a lot like Maine's. In California, the typical way of doing things is to wait for the bond issue. The entire state budget is spent every year on committed to various purposes. So everything at the margin in California is, let's wait for a bond issue. And then we'll finally have some money to do things. Don't do that so much here in Maine. We got a little more complicated situation with respect to our bond issues. But the problems are the same. The conversations are the same. The challenges are the same. So what I'm going to talk about today is, in some senses, it is particular to Maine, and in some ways it's universal to communities facing the consequences of climate change, particularly in coastal areas. Now, one of the big challenges with climate change is we know the direction. It's that way, or that way, depending on what you're counting. But we do not know the pace or the extent to which it will happen. No one does. The recent report that just released this week from the IPCC improves our understanding of the risk a little bit, but we're still all playing in the dark with respect to what is going to happen, when is it going to happen, when should we act, how much should we act now versus in the future. A lot of the discussion about climate change and adaptation revolves around the question of not just what are we going to do, but when are we going to do it, and how are we going to pace ourselves over the next century as we endure the consequences of our emissions into the atmosphere. There are a lot of pictures, there are a lot of models out there. We work with a lot of the climate models that are out there. I was afraid this would not show up very well, but this is the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is probably the model that is most commonly used because it was consistently estimated across the entire United States. It's wrong, but all models are wrong, and some models are useful. So this one has a utility. I selected two pictures from it. One is, this is for 3 feet of sea level rise. When that 3 feet of sea level rise occurs, I don't know. It could occur as early as 2030. Not a big chance of that happening, but the models say it could be as early as 10 years from now, or more likely it will occur sometime between 2060 and 2080. Downtown Belfast is underwater. Castine, where my wife's from, becomes an island. My wife's family fortunately lived north of the neck, so they are still on mainland. But Castine essentially becomes an island. If we look at southern Maine, virtually all of the beaches are gone. And if you look up here in Portland, the hottest development zone in Portland just today announced a brand new major office building down on the old Portland Company site, underwater. Back Bay, part of USM, underwater. Now, this is tidal flooding. This can be interpreted as tidal flooding, or it can be interpreted as storm surge. The sea level rise viewer is ambiguous as to those questions. But this is a problem throughout all of the Maine coast. It is a larger problem south of Cape Elizabeth, where the coast is flatter. Essentially, from Cape Elizabeth is a major turning point in the biogeography of the North America. South of Cape Elizabeth, it is primarily sand dunes, barrier islands, wetlands. East of Cape Elizabeth, it is primarily rocky headlands with interspersed beaches and wetlands. But the rocky beaches, the rocky cliffs, the rock-bound coast of Maine isn't going to save us. There are still lots of low-lying places. There is large-scale erosion and erodible bluffs all the way down the coast. So no part of Maine is going to escape this. So here are the things I want you to remember from my talk. 1, mitigation is much cheaper than adaptation. Every day we hear about how doing something about climate change is going to cost too much. So let's not do anything. They are not comparing the costs of climate change to the right thing. They are not comparing the costs of climate change mitigation to the cost of adaptation. There is not enough money in the world to adapt to climate change. There's not enough money unless we literally give up almost everything else and do nothing but keep repairing the damages from storms and flooding and fires. There's not enough money to adapt to climate change. It is much cheaper to not have to adapt than to have to adapt. Now, we are going to have to adapt because the dice have been cast. We are already in climate change. The only question now is how far is it going to go? It will be much cheaper to keep it from going much further than to adapt to the full consequences of it. So my first message to you is not about financing adaptation. It is about, if you want to deal with adaptation and find the money to stop climate change. It is much cheaper. Climate change and sea level rise projections understate the risks. Almost everything you see about the extent of sea level rise understates the actual risks as best as we can measure them. You are already doing adaptation. You may not be doing it very well, but you are already doing it. And so the first step of adaptation is to understand what you are doing now that can be done better. Rather than looking for money from Augusta, look at what you're doing now and ask, how can we do this better? There's more money than you think to do this. One of my basic points today is there's more money for climate change adaptation than you think there is. But there is not enough to take care of all the needs. And what you are going to have to do in order to access the funds that are there is to become much more cooperative and much more creative. You are underinsured. I don't care how much insurance you have, it's not enough. And in many cases, the amount of insurance you have is zero. We're all sitting around waiting for Congress to pay for the next disaster. This will not work much longer. So, if you are underinsured, it's time to start thinking about what role insurance plays in adaptation. Adaptation is a multi-decadal response. You should be thinking now about how you would use money in the 2050s or 2060s to respond to a hurricane. You will not be doing it, but somebody else will be. And when somebody else 30, 40, 50 years down the road encounters the disaster, to be able to pull out from the files and unearth from somebody's computer or snag it from somebody's Google Drive a plan for what to do and how to make the community more resilient after each event, more will be done quickly then than if you simply say, okay, that's tomorrow's problems. So you have to think in multi-decadal actions, even if you do not take those actions right away. Both public and private resources will be needed. This is not a question of simply finding enough money from Washington or Augusta or the town hall. This is about combining public and private resources, and you're going to have to do it in fairly creative and not always comfortable ways if you're going to find the money to do the things that need to be done. Let me just go back through each of those points and provide some support for them. The first comes from this report, which was released on Wednesday, the Ocean and Cryosphere and a Changing Climate. This is the new IPCC report. It's 1,140 pages long in entirety. I haven't read it yet. But I was on a plane, so I have an excuse. One of the quotes from it: if humanity manages to quickly lower its carbon pollution in the next few decades, then sea level rise by 2100 may never exceed about 1 foot, the report says. This will be tough but manageable. If carbon pollution continues to, from Michael Oppenheimer, who's an American on the IPCC, if carbon pollution continues rising through the middle of the century, i.e. 30 years away, then sea level rise by 2100 could exceed 2 feet 9 inches, or about 0.8 meters. Then the job will be too big. It will be an unmanageable problem. So we've got about 30 years, maybe 20 years, to keep keep carbon emissions so that we get to no more than 0.8 meters, a little under 3 feet. Incidentally, the official position of the United States government is that climate change by 2100 will exceed 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. That's the position that the Trump administration has taken in its decision to rescind the auto emissions standards. It's in their documentations. It basically says, climate change, we're going to get to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius, so why bother lowering tailpipe emissions? So the official position of the federal government today, as recorded in regulatory filings, implies a sea level rise of between 1 and 2 meters, or more than twice what is mentioned here. Just a footnote. When I say that we are underappreciating the risks, so work that we're doing now in California and in Maine is all based on the idea that this kind of typical sea level rise graph, this happens to be from Monterey, California, under the 4.5 degree emission scenario, but it doesn't matter. You can get the same shape of the graph from the data in Maine. We just haven't been able to pull the Maine data yet. But this is the way we think about sea level rise, as kind of a gradual increase. Maybe it accelerates a little sometime in the mid part of the century. This one does. But that's not reality. Reality is we don't know. As the IPCC report makes abundantly clear, and this has been known for some time, the real risks here are that either the Greenland ice sheet or the West Antarctic ice shelf will let go catastrophically and suddenly. And then you will be looking at sea level rises in excess of 2 meters or 80 inches. And those would occur within a year. The latest evidence from Greenland is that ice is melting there faster than any previous prediction had allotted. Just a footnote. This is the reality of sea level rise. The reality is that there is a low probability of very high sea level rise and a very low probability of no sea level rise or very low sea level rise, and a probability of roughly 93% in Monterey that it would be between 0 and 1 meter, with the mean right about here. But what really is happening here, and I don't want to bore you with statistics, but yeah, I do. So this is what you graph in the previous graph. This point here represents this point here. But the reality is all of these are possible. And it is more possible that it will be higher. It is equally possible, or I should say, it is equally possible that it will be higher and lower. You need to think about the problem not as a straight line and we just need to pick off the right number. You need to think of it as a continuously shifting set of probabilities. We're all at the roulette table, folks. The game is on. Le jeu s'en fait. The ball is rolling. With roulette, we know what the probabilities are of a red or a black, an odd or an even or a specific number, because there are only 36 holes. With climate change, we don't know how many holes are on the roulette table. But we know that the ball is spinning. Financing the costs of adaptation is about packaging. It is not about a single thing that you're going to do. It is about pulling together sources from money from different sources. I said that my last takeaway was it's about public and private resources. So here is a convenient way to think about how to combine resources. Ask, who pays? Is it the public or the private sector? Who benefits? Is it the public or the private sector? And by the private sector, I mean homeowners, I mean us, individually. We're the private sector, as well as part of the public. if you divide the world into who pays and who benefits, there are 4 pots of possible money. One is here in box 1. Benefits are purely public. The public pays for them. They cannot be meaningfully divided among users to allocate costs. General tax revenues, GO bonds, specialized consumption taxes, and so on are all. This is where we're all rummaging around under the couch cushions in this box. Okay, got to think about these other boxes, where the benefits are to private entities, but the public pays for them. There are a lot of such programs. Publicly subsidized tax expenditures, tax subsidies such as income tax credits, property tax credits, revenue bonds, moral obligation bonds, are all ways in which private benefits are translated into, or provide broad public benefits. Private money. This is where, let me go to this box first. No, I'll stay in this one. This is where the innovations are occurring, and they are occurring very fast. These include things like impact investing or green bonds. Just Tuesday before I left California, I got an email that the first major resilience bond was issued for the European Union. These are bonds in which not only is there an expectation of repayment, yeah, you got to pay for them. There's also an expectation of some impact, including reductions in carbon emissions, and increasingly, and this market is beginning to grow, increases in resilience. So resilience is becoming a subject that is bondable in the private bond market. And the first group of bonds issued for coastal resilience have come out of the European Union. We got a long way to go on this one, but it means we're tapping new sources because there's no more money in Europe than there is here to do this. There are private organizations created to share benefits among organizations and funders. Hazard assessment districts. Throughout the United States, there are flood control districts where the people who benefit from flood control structures pay for them with an assessment on their property taxes. This is almost never done in Maine, but it will be done. We will have hazard assessment districts in Maine because to build and operate the flood control structures that are going to be needed, we're going to have some distribution of the benefits of those to the people who directly benefit and those who indirectly benefit, which means sharing the cost between the public and the private sector. Tax increment financing districts, a lot of TIF is already being used for this purpose in Maine. It's a little squishy about whether that's a good idea or not. Water and sewer districts are a classic example, and increasingly stormwater, which is a corollary of climate change, is going to have to be dealt with. Private charges for service in proportion to private benefits. Goods and service charges, and insurance and reinsurance. And I'll have more to say about insurance and reinsurance and catastrophe bonds in a minute. But as you think about the question of who pays, ask the question who benefits. And try to match the extent, as much as possible, who benefits with who pays. You're already doing adaptation. Adaptation is basically, you have 3 choices. It's not complicated. You can build a barrier between yourself and the water. And that can be a gray barrier, a wall, an engineered structure. It can be a green barrier, a beach, a wetland, a dune. You can change structures. You can move them up. You can move them back. Or you can retreat from the coast. Get the hell out of the hazard zone. We are going to do 1 and 2. Eventually, we're going to have to do 3, though we are not ready to confront the need to retreat. let's just talk about some examples. So this is Higgins Beach, Maine. Can't see it very well. Sorry about that. This is where they built the seawall. And these are folks who are sunning themselves sitting in the water because there's no beach left in front of the seawall. This is Higgins Beach, Maine. No seawall, nice beach at high tide. Seawall, no beach. Classic problem in coastal engineering. How do we build the structures that we need to protect things but keep the natural processes to some extent at work? You see this all over Maine. Here's an example of natural infrastructure, what's called natural infrastructure or green infrastructure. This is Ocean Park in Old Orchard Beach. This dune system here in front of the beach and between the beach and the houses is entirely artificial. It was constructed in the 60s and 70s. This is all anchored by seagrass, and it is very resilient. It has one of the lowest erosion rates in the Saco Bay region. You can't see the beach from the hotel. This is the Nautilus Hotel. You can't see the beach unless you get up on the higher floors. My brother stays here every summer on the top floor, so we can see the beach. But this is natural infrastructure that is very resilient, at least for some time. This is Spring Point Marina in South Portland. This is my boat right here, the Dismal Scientist. This is taken from the patio of this building, which is called 43 North. It's a new restaurant that was built there last year after the old restaurant kind of, the owners decided to give up running the restaurant, and the decision was made to build a new one because the old building was not really a restaurant. Now, because this is the marina I keep my boat, I actually asked the owners of the marina, why are you building a restaurant so close to the water? And they said, well, wait a minute. We actually moved the building back. It's now 1 foot out of the flood zone. I said, just make sure my boat is out of the water. Because I don't want it ending up in their front yard, in their patio. This is a structural adaptation in Maine to erosion. This is Wells Beach. Notice all of the seawalls. This is a structural adaptation in Dare, North Carolina, on the Outer Banks, where if you want to build a house today, you build it with a minimum of a 10-foot clearance for the waves. That's us. That's what real structural adaptation looks like. So, here are your choices. You can move things around, move them farther than 1 foot out of the flood zone. Just a hint. You can build them up. You can change the structures. You can build barriers, or you can get out of the way. Those are your choices. At the end of the day, some version of those things are what you're going to do. Now, in thinking about money, this is going to be a hard idea. In thinking about money, you want to think about 2 phases of planning: pre-disaster and post-disaster. You do not want to be in a situation like this saying, okay, where are we going to get money? This is not the time to plan for that when it looks like this. This is a Hurricane Michael impact in the Gulf. You want to be doing it when things look like this, which means you want to know when the disaster comes that you are ready to do things and you're ready to use the money that may become available. You have a plan for doing that. So let's look at some examples of the financing principles I've talked about. In box 1, public benefits, public finance, infrastructure spending, water, transportation, water, and energy. Those 3 types of infrastructure spending are the places where we are already making key decisions and key investments in adaptation. We got to find a way to adapt those spending patterns to the challenge of sea level rise. There are lots of opportunities when we update and upgrade infrastructure, when we rebuild it, when we build new construction, and when we rebuild it after a disaster. You want to know, after a disaster, do you want to move your electric lines or your water and sewer lines? Pre-disasters, funding can come from the Corps of Engineers. Wetlands restoration funds. Key part of thinking about adaptation is natural infrastructure. There's a lot of work on restoring wetlands which provide some flooding barriers. There's FEMA pre-disaster money, and there's other random sources of money in various pots around government. Post-disasters, most of what we see is emergency appropriations and FEMA flood mitigation spending. A word about post-disaster emergency appropriations. Congress is already pulling back from its historic role in pretty much writing blank checks to appropriations for post-disaster, and this is largely because the disasters have become so large that Congress literally can't find the money, finds it very difficult to find the money to fund all of them. All of the last few major appropriations have essentially shortchanged the adaptation in the recovery in various ways. Congress has also changed the tax law. It used to be that if you had a disaster, a fire, a flood, or some other disaster in your house, you could deduct the uninsured, unrecovered costs from your taxes. No longer. You can only deduct those things if you were in a presidentially declared disaster zone, as I learned to my cost. So Congress has essentially reset the tax law in terms of recovery so that it only supports people who are in presidentially declared disasters. That frees up a lot of money in the tax code to do other things, but it is a sign of what's to come as Congress increasingly pulls back on fully spending on recovery. I mentioned impact investment, green bonds. Another thing that's just come out this week is the first set of standards for impact investing for resilience. So one of the things you want to know if you're going to buy a bond to support communities in their resilience efforts is, what am I buying? What's the measure of success that I'm buying if I'm going to lend people money? And now the first set of standards for how you can judge success have been published. This will increase the amount of money people are willing to invest because now they have specific standards to look at. I mentioned appropriations and tax deductions. Special purpose districts, tax increment financing, flood control, stormwater, P3 or public-private partnerships, insurance. Pre-disaster, FEMA has the community rating system. If you do not know about the community rating system, learn about it. It lowers the cost of flood insurance and increases the participation in the program. If you don't know about community rating systems, learn about it. And here's the trick. Community rating system for FEMA is a very good guide to how you can update and change local zoning ordinances, infrastructure plans, and so on. You get the benefits of reduced rates and increased participation in the flood program, but more importantly, you get a lot of good ideas for you to do at relatively low cost. So integrate the community rating system with other planning processes in your communities. That's a really good first step to doing all of the things that I'm talking about. Flood insurance. Let me talk about the flood insurance program in a minute. What I want to mention now is catastrophe bonds and resilience bonds, which are the newest innovation in this area. Now, I'll explain catastrophe bonds. I think David Levy's going to talk about them in his presentation, so I won't spend much time on them. Let's just say they are a do-it-yourself insurance company. Don't like what the insurance companies have to offer you? You can design your own insurance policy and get people to buy a bond which would pay off in the event of a disaster. That sounds like a great idea. The problem is they have to be very big bonds in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. No community in Maine can do a catastrophe bond. Maine as a whole could, which will bring me to a key point a little later on. Resilience bonds are a riff on catastrophe bonds in that they are about using the proceeds from the savings to fund resilient efforts. A few words about flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program completely distorts the flood insurance market in the U.S. Now, everybody knows that the flood insurance program is a major problem. It has its payouts are the demands on it are way in excess of the premiums it collects. The top line of this is the premiums that the flood insurance collects. The bottom line are the payouts. Now, it is often said that the flood insurance is subsidized. This is not correct. It is said that flood insurance is actuarially incorrect. It is not actuarially incorrect if you assume it is measured at the risk of the 1960s when the flood insurance program was implemented. This is not the 60s anymore. The problem with the flood insurance program is that it has not kept up with the increasing cost and severity of disasters. That's the problem. We have not modernized the insurance. We have not raised the premiums to the point where it is covering this risk. But for most people in the flood insurance program, they are paying a fair rate. But for the problem as a whole, because of very high risk areas like the Gulf Coast, the program as a whole is in deep trouble. It is often said that the problem is we keep putting back the same property to be insured again. And there are cases of flood insurance paying for people to be put back 10 or 11 times. They're all in Louisiana. The Gulf Coast is where the repetitive loss properties are a problem. Only in York County in Maine has there been even a couple of repetitive loss properties. So RLPs are part of the problem, but they are not the whole problem. The whole problem is disasters and floods are getting too big and too expensive, partly because we keep sticking people into floods ways, and partly because the floods themselves are getting bigger. Maine has, I think this is 2016, 8,712 flood insurance policies in place. New Hampshire has 8,756, with less than half the area and 1/10 the coastline. We are underinsured even by the standards of the government's insurance program. And we are completely non-insured for public properties. Premiums are going to go up for flood insurance, which is going to create a problem because people aren't going to want to pay them. Increasing cost will reduce demand, and this is why the community rating system offset is going to become so important. The way in which you can deal with the question of the increasing cost of insurance is to increase resilience by upping your score on the community rating system. So every community in Maine ought to be, with flood hazard, ought to be looking at the CRS as a way to get more people into the flood insurance program at relatively modest cost. We will eventually confront managed retreat. We are eventually going to have to say, don't build there again. The problem is, in the U.S., there's a little thing called Lucas versus the South Carolina Coastal Council. Supreme Court case from 30 years ago, which basically said if the state says you can't rebuild, they owe you the fair market value of the property. That prohibiting you from rebuilding is a taking, an unconstitutional taking, unless you are compensated. I don't know what the answer to this one is going to be. In Canada, there is no takings clause. And so in Canada, in Quebec, for example, there's a very large buyback program after floods up on the Ottawa River. In the U.S., it's very difficult to fund or get acceptance of the retreat issue. In California, the city of Del Mar, down in San Diego County, they put in a managed retreat process in their local coastal plan. The citizens rose up, fired the entire planning staff, fired the entire planning board, and put in a new planning board which said, we will only do seawalls. Yeah. We are eventually, I think, but not for another 20 years, we will eventually move to private flood insurance as in the property and casualty market, and the public will provide reinsurance to the private insurers. That is, the private insurers will buy insurance from the public sector, as they do from the current reinsurance market, to cover their losses. This is the only system I can think of that will ultimately work, but we're a ways away from it. But there's a lot you can do with insurance now. Look at the insurance on your roads, on your public buildings. Ask yourself, can you get insurance? Ask, is there a way in which the state government could set up a public facilities insurance process and buy a collective policy for coastal infrastructure? There's a lot that can be done before we get to finally confronting the disaster that is the disaster relief program called flood insurance. That's a picture of, we were talking about this last night at dinner. That's a picture of the 78 extratropical cyclone. It's the one that knocked down my house. So how do we create a finance package that works? And it's a reminder that it's not hurricane in Maine, it ain't the hurricanes. There have been bad hurricanes in Maine. Hurricane Bob in '92 and the '37 hurricane were historic storms. But Maine is much more likely to be hit by storms in the winter. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the Patriots Day storm from a couple of years ago. I had the Northeast storm in there originally, but I put the Patriots Day storm in. We're much more likely to be hit in the winter than the summer. Extratropical cyclones, not tropical cyclones. Look for flood protection that provides multiple benefits. Natural infrastructure does more than just protect properties. It provides a lot of different benefits. It's a multi-decadal process. If you can't afford it now, think about where you would look for the money in 2030 or 2040. You don't have to find all the money now. You don't have to do everything now. Don't do everything now, because you don't know how bad it's going to be. But do it sooner rather than later, and make sure you've planned for later. How do you use disasters to reduce vulnerability to future disasters? That is entirely a function of pre-planning. What might not work now may work in a decade or two. Think outside the NOFA. The NOFA is the Notice of Funding Availability. Think outside, waiting for the government, the federal government or even the state government, to simply say, here's some money. Though I must say, California has been much more generous with its communities in providing funds to support adaptation planning, and it would be a high priority for me in Maine for state government to provide some supplemental funds, either through the coastal program or other means, to communities to do the necessary planning. You can do it in phases. California did it in 4 phases. Communities got up between $250,000 and $500,000. That's the amount of money you should. And we're not talking $5K here or $7K, to do a little bit. You got to be thinking minimum of $100,000 a town. Minimum $100,000 a town to do the planning. Combine public and private resources. Create new jurisdictions. You're going to have to create new hazard districts. You're going to have to create new catastrophe bond districts. No community in Maine, including Portland and South Portland, can do this on their own. We're too small. If you want to tap the global market, in Maine, we are way too small. So we got to get big. We might even, and I hesitate to say this, have to go in with New Hampshire on some of these things. There's lots of stuff that can be done. One of the areas that I think is very important for Maine is this idea of go big. We're not really good at that. There are some agencies like the Municipal Bond Bank and FAME, for whom I worked for a little bit, that could provide, are not today ready to do this, but they could provide some of the financial services needed to access some of these more innovative funding markets, like impact bonds and catastrophe bonds. So there's a lot that can be done. There's capacity to be tapped, but it will take some work to get that done. We're going to have to create a change in the National Flood Insurance Program to go from recovery to resilience. So there's a lot of work to be done. As I said at the beginning, better not to have to do this than to have to do it. But we are going to have to do it to some extent. There are answers out there. There are funds out there. But it's going to take work and serious thought about the magnitude of the challenge. This is not something anyone has ever experienced. There is no historical guidance for how to deal with a problem this size. It is our challenge to be the first ones to have to deal with it. And like all trailblazers, we will, of course, be the ones who get whacked in the face. But it is a trail that we are on whether we choose to be or not. We have to deal with these issues. I hope that in the course of the day, from what I've given you, you can find a lot of different and additional ideas to chart your course. Thank you.
That was just remarkable. We're going to hold questions for now. We have a couple of places later in the day when we may be able to take some. Are you here for the day?
I am.
So I encourage you at lunchtime or at breaks to reach out to Charlie. Charlie mentioned the community rating system. Ruta, would you stand up, please? The Municipal Planning Assistance Program at the state has done a lot of work on this. You can contact Ruta. She'll be here for the day. Also, Sue Baker at the Maine Floodplain Management Program. If your community is interested, I encourage you to reach out to both of them. We're going to take a very quick break as we turn around and get ready for the next group. Before we do that, Sam asked me to give you what you need in order to get on the internet here. So it's U as in umbrella, F as in Frank, M as in Michael, B as in bottle, UFMB.